Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Throughout the early stages of this year, we have looked at the first two Streets of Rage games and what overall impact the titles had on the world of gaming. In today's video, we are going to look at the third game from this classic trilogy and take an in-depth look at exactly what it brought to the table to help try and separate it from the pack. Some controversial decisions were made with this one, some of which would cause a fair amount of outrage at the time. But despite this, is Streets of Rage 3 a worthy sequel to one of the greatest beat-em-ups of all time? Was the trilogy rounded off with the most refined edition in the series? Well, let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Streets of Rage 3 and why it caused outrage. Yeah! The original Streets of Rage game, released back in 1991, was a huge commercial and critical success. The game was inspired and heavily based off of the creation of Final Fight, the classic Capcom arcade game that saw a Super Nintendo port early in the platform's life cycle. Sega saw an opening to easily top this game, as the scaled down console port of Final Fight only offered one player support. So Streets of Rage was programmed to offer two-player cooperative play and was developed to offer more fleshed out fighting mechanics too. The game was obviously hugely popular and gave consumers an early reason to choose a Mega Drive over a Super Nintendo. With any cash cow comes a sequel, and when it came to Streets of Rage 2, Sega went above and beyond to ensure that the second entry in the series was bigger and better than arguably any game that had come on the whole Mega Drive platform before it. Development of this game was a huge undertaking, especially when you consider that the game saw release just 1 year after the original game. This was only made possible due to a huge collaborative effort between Sega and 5 other development houses, who all worked in unison to ensure that this title was one of the greatest ever made. As you can tell, the plan was executed absolutely perfectly, resulting in not just a great arcade-style beat-em-up, but a beat-em-up that was arguably better than any game from the genre that could actually be found in the arcades. An absolutely crazy achievement, come to think of it. Everything about the game offers close to a perfect gameplay experience, from the game's stunning visuals that were painstakingly refined before being given approval, to the impressive combat mechanics that were heavily influenced by Street Fighter 2. This game was next level stuff and was made even more memorable thanks to the god tier music in the game that was mostly composed by Yuzo Koshiro. What a game Streets of Rage 2 is! As expected, the second Streets of Rage game was yet another huge commercial success for Sega, so the creation of a third entry in the series would be a no-brainer for the corporate entity. The only problem you could argue that Sega had here is that how do you top a game that is already near perfect? So let's begin looking at Streets of Rage 3 and see exactly what Sega did to try and tackle this tall challenge. Streets of Rage 3, known as Bare Knuckle 3 in Japan, would once again be a title with an ambitiously short development cycle for such an important game. The game would release in Japan in March of 1994, just 15 months after the release of the second game in the series. Just like with the development of the first two games, a lot of heart and passion was put into the game. Sadly, so much so that not even all of the ideas could even be used, as demonstrated by this early pre-release screenshot, illustrating a section of the game where the players got to ride motorcycles. The game, whilst published by Sega, was once again developed in yet another collaborative effort with Ancient once again, a development house with Yuzo Koshiro at the helm, who we shall speak about more later in the video. As mentioned earlier, there was a huge jump in quality between the first two Streets of Rage games, due to most areas of the second entry being more refined than that of the first. When it came to Streets of Rage 3, Sega and Ancient would set out to achieve a similar feat. In order to try and make this reality, Streets of Rage 3 would be programmed to include a more complex plot, character dialogue, even more multiple endings, longer stages, increased difficulty options, more in-depth scenarios, and even faster gameplay. So, let's talk about some of these elements and how they impacted on the game's overall quality. The plot of the game once again revolves around the series' antagonist, Mr. X, the leader of a dangerous crime syndicate. This time around, Mr. X has started a questionable research company known as RoboPsi Corporation. As part of his evil scheme, he has brought Dr. Dharm on board, the world's best roboticist. Together, they look to replace every important official in the city with realistic-looking robots. This is hoped to be achieved by placing bombs around the city as a distraction for the police to deal with. This brings us to the game's character lineup. Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding and Eddie Skate Hunter all return to action. This is a result of being contacted by the game's new playable character, Dr. Zan, who discovers what Mr. X's research corporation was really for. So Dr. Zan, along with 3 of the older cast members, set out to save the city from villainy once again. In terms of the title's gameplay, like the 2 previous Streets of Rage games, the entry is yet another arcade-style side-scrolling beat-em-up, in which up to 2 players must fight their way through waves upon waves of enemies. The 3 returning playable characters handle similarly to the previous installment, but the new character, Dr. Zan, brings something a bit different to the table. Zan is a robot who automatically converts every weapon pickup into a ball of energy, which he can utilise against his foes. Speaking of the game's characters, another way this game differed from previous installments was that this game was the first in the series to feature additional playable unlockable characters, all of which we shall discuss shortly. But for now, let's check out this title's level design and narrative progression. After the game's Star Wars-esque opening text crawl and then choosing a playable fighter, character dialogue boxes show the characters having a conversation about whether Dr. Zan is telling the truth, whilst they are disposing of the city's first bomb. This then brings the player or players into the opening stage, which takes place in a warehouse. Instantly, players will notice that graphically, the game looks very similar to Streets of Rage 2. It also features many of the exact same enemy sprites and appears to be running in the same engine. In some ways, we could look at this as a lazy effort, but then again, why try and fix something when it is clearly not broken to begin with? Later in the stage, you must take on suited and booted gun-wielding enemies as you progress further through this area until you arrive outside fighting on a dock. The stage continues to throw up an assortment of enemies from the first game, including those that can ride motorbikes. During this section of the stage, many enemies also arrive via a speedboat, which makes good use of the watery backdrop effects. As the stage progresses, so does the passage of time, and we go from daylight to sunset as we near the stage boss. What makes the first boss interesting is that Shiva is also one of the game's playable characters, who can be unlocked by holding down the B button after defeating him, a first for a Streets of Rage game. After beating the South Pier warehouse stage, the player progresses to the downtown stage, which starts out with featuring a backdrop that looks very reminiscent of the ones from the opening stages from the first 2 Streets of Rage titles. There are neon lights aplenty, and the whole thing just feels very well Streets of Ragey. During this part of the stage, a mid-boss fight occurs against an evil clown and a kangaroo. Upon defeating these odd opponents, the kangaroo is freed, offering the player another unlockable character to play as. Nice! The next part of the stage takes place in what appears to be a nightclub, with lasers and lighting effects aplenty, with a crowd in the background to add to the stage's overall look. The lights even flicker on and off, offering a strobe-like effect to add to the overall experience. Very innovative level design in my opinion. A boss fight takes place on this stage in the bar area against athletic twin female opponents, Lisa and Mona. Intricate details are added to the backdrop of this scene, including aquarium walls behind the bar and glass bottles falling from the top of the bar as the battle commences. After finding a note in the bar about the whereabouts of the syndicate, stage 3 takes place on the District K construction site. Combat starts out in this stage whilst the player dodges barrels falling from above. A construction site in a location based on New York City, featuring falling barrels? Is this a not so subtle nod to Donkey Kong? Apart from dodging the barrels, players must be careful not to fall down pits. This is the first stage in the game where there are more than just enemies to worry about. The latter part of the stage puts further pressure on the player, as they must punch their way through concrete barriers, Chuck Norris style, to avoid being hit by the auto-scrolling bulldozer that is hurtling towards the player. Again, some really fresh level design for a Streets of Rage title. Next in the stage, we return to more familiar ground. Red beams aplenty whilst traversing an enemy field moving lift. Classic beat-em-up action and typical scenery. Atop the construction site is the next boss encounter, which takes place against your character's robotic doppelganger, proving once and for all that everything Dr. Zan said was true. Progress into the next stage, the cast find a concealed door that leads to an underground stage, featuring a railway track with fast-moving carts that must be avoided by players as they plough through waves of enemies. This area that functions as the Syndicate's trade route begins to look more mine-like as you progress. The boss fight takes place against a red armoured samurai named Yamato, who has the power of creating clones of himself mid-fight. Whilst we will touch more on the music later, this part of the game is particularly interesting as it features remixed music from the opening stage of Revenge of Shinobi. After defeating Yamato, it appears he was guarding the Syndicate's hideout, which is where the next stage takes place. Surprisingly, the Syndicate's hideout has a very eastern feel to it that feels more like the lair of Save the Yakuza than it would a New York City crime syndicate. Tangents aside, I think the level looks fine, it just doesn't really fit the theme of the game very well. Soon the player finds themselves within Mr. X's skyscraper, first brawling their way through an elegant hallway, then through an elevator section for further classic beat-em-up trope action. At the top of the tower, Mr. X can be found sitting in his gold-plated Trump Tower-like throne room. Mr. X watches you defeat waves of enemies, and bearing in mind that this is not the final stage, I assume you can guess what happens next. The Mr. X the player faces is yet just another robotic doppelganger. The following stage starts with the player fighting their way through more lavish hallways, defeating Terminator-like robots, before going down in a lift to defeat gangsters, dominatrixes and other recurring enemies. During this stage, the team save the head of the city's police force, before progressing to the outside of the building to face off against classic-style jetpack-wielding adversaries, like in the previous game. The onslaught continues until Adam from the first Streets of Rage game makes a surprise appearance, gunning down the enemies in a helicopter, reuniting the old friends. On the next level, we are brought behind enemy lines to a woodland-like area as the players progress closer to the end of the game. Finally, the characters arrive inside the RoboSci Corporation's factory, where they must traverse moving conveyor belts and dodge lasers whilst facing off against both robotic and human opponents alike. As you have probably noticed by this point, it seems that the game has taken a great deal of influence from the likes of Terminator and RoboCop, which is a change of pace from the martial arts focused theme of the previous game. Even the boss fight in this stage takes place against tech. The stage does not quite end here though, as next you meet the real Mr. X, who is now just a brain in a tube, reminiscent of Mother Brain from the Metroid series. The final fight takes place against a powerful robot who must be defeated in 3 minutes before Mr. X uses his bombs to blow up the whole city. Upon finishing this game, the ending of the game varies depending on which difficulty setting the player completes the game on, giving the game an extra edge of replayability and giving gamers an incentive to play through the game again on more challenging difficulty settings. Endings are also triggered by events that happen through a playthrough. For example, if the player is unable to save the police chief in one of the latter stages, then an alternative final stage takes place in a location that is supposedly the White House, where you take on Shiva once again. Defeating him triggers the bad ending, where he reveals Mr. X will finish you, who happens to be watching the whole thing through a monitor. Looking at all of the stages throughout this game, it's clear that many elements are recycled from Streets of Rage 2, but at the same time the game offers enough to stand on its own 2 feet. Speaking of the changes, it is also of note that although combat remains largely similar, there were still tweaks to it all here and there. For example, only Skate could run in the previous game. Just import the Japanese game so that players could get the real experience. Many reviewers also thought the game was too similar to Streets of Rage 2.